Welcome back to another Tonic discussion, everyone. Today we have Grant Smith, Mark Bizone, and John Carter. I'm Harrison Cayley, and today we're discussing an article that I found from John called Fail Better, Tacitus and the Art on Tacitus and Art on the Dissident Right. This is an article the Raw Egg Nationalist wrote for Asylum magazine, and starts out with a discussion of Tacitus, or Tacitus as some say, on his style of history, basically his Latin style, and comparing that to previous Latin prose like Cicero or Cicero and Caesar, and how Tacitus kind of adopted a new style. And Ren or Ren, I'm not sure. John, what would be the proper pronunciation of his acronym?
I usually just say Ren for raw egg
Ren. Okay,
nationalist. Yeah.
we'll call him Ren. So Ren kind of applies this to aesthetics and like the new art, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Most of the article is actually, I'd say, oh, well, is it most of it? Yeah, well, themed towards art, what the new art will look like, and kind of why all art sucks today, and how turning to the past, kind of a return to tradition, trying to write like a an epic poem in the style of Dante or something like that probably isn't going to work, and that's not how art works. That art builds on what has come before, builds on the current style, and so if there's ever going to be a good new art, um, it takes kind of a pessimistic view and says it might not come around, we might not see it, but we should create the conditions for our children and our grandchildren and our great grandchildren to maybe create something great. The first thing I thought of when reading this article was, I mean, because off the on the heels of our last discussion on kind of Peter Turchin and that Palladium article on like competence, I was reading Turchin's new book End Times, and there's an interesting section on that, on political systems and political cultures and their continuity. And so, well, I won't necessarily say anything about that right now, but we'll see how the discussion goes, and maybe I'll come back to that. But with that said, what were your guys' initial impressions of this article? What kind of thoughts did it prompt in you?
It's a little depressing to consider the possibility that it is impossible under current historical circumstances to create great art, but it does seem it does seem pretty accurate, unfortunately. If I look back over the last couple of decades, I have a hard time pointing to very much that I would consider to be of superlative quality in literature or the visual arts or even in the characteristic art of the Western world, cinema. Um, it's all been dominated by things that are quite derivative uh, in a particularly clumsy way of better things that came before. Um, Certainly in science fiction, something that I know fairly well. The last, I mean, there's been a few good books published in the last 20 years, but very little that was deeply original in the way that sort of the golden age science fiction was, or the pulp age science fiction was. It's all kind of reaching back to that and trying to do it again. Uh, so that
Do
was
you
sort of,
think
mhm.
how long do you think that's just a recent thing, like the past 20 years? How far back do you think this phenomenon
I would
goes?
I would say so, actually. I can think of all sorts of science fiction from the 1980s and 1990s that was highly original and very readable. Really just kind of set my imagination on fire in a way that the stuff that's come out since then hasn't. And I think you see something similar with music. Um, it's really hard to point to any artists of the last 20 years that have the same stature as the artists of the 1960s or 70s. certainly with the classical composers of the past. Uh, so, but partly, that could just be the takeover of entertainment by conglomerates. Partly, it could be the influence of the internet and kind of fracturing society into a million different little echo chambers. But Ren kind of points to just at a sort of structural level that we don't have the education now to produce really high quality art. If you read literature from the 19th century, I mean, those guys were so incredibly well educated. Their sentence structure alone was far more intricate than anything you tend to find now. They would, throw out things in German or French or Latin or Greek and just expect that their readers would be able to read it, would get these obscure references to classical history or what have you. And these are things that you just cannot do now. The writers don't even have that preparation. And even if they did, you cannot assume that the readers do either. We've been dumbed down so much that producing something really deep and meaningful and broad is it's hard to see exactly how that would happen. Even if it did happen, how it would get any sort of audience. So that was kind of like I think the sort of depressing thrust of what he said. But he also, I think that a little bit more optimistically, he was getting at the point that rather than trying to just redo badly what was done better in the past, we should try to do well what we can do now in a style that fits the current age. Hence this comparison of Tacitus to Julius Caesar or Cicero. And that by doing that, we can take what is valuable from the past, wrap it up in sort of new packaging that fits the present and as a kind of protective shell almost, and pass that on to the future, laying the seeds for hopefully something great that will come about in a few generations if we're lucky.
One thing that
I
stood
mean,
out.
like,
Okay. No, go ahead, Mark.
no, I mean, like, well, if you're going to riff off of that, go right ahead, Harrison, because I have my own sort of thing to say. No, okay.
No, go ahead.
So, yeah, so like, as you guys know from private discussion, like I struggled with this one a bit, and I think, I reread it, and part of the reason I think I was struggling is because I'm not really familiar with Ren's work, and maybe I was supposed to assume from past readings is what I felt was that that he already had sort of qualifications for greatness, the greatness of art, and particularly the greatness of the storytelling art, that we were to assume going in. But in the article itself, it lacks, in my opinion, it just lacked either the examples or even the counter examples that I would need in order to fully assess what he was saying. So I think that, and as you know, like, this is something that's been on my mind. If you read Black Speech, for example, language development, artistic language development is something that's kind of near and dear to me. And so I guess the first thing that I thought after the second read was about the art of storytelling itself, meaning, all myths, legends, histories, poems, plays, literature, even films, basically every construction of words meant to convey a string of events with a beginning and an end. And then after that, I thought, okay, so that's a story. What makes a story great? And what I thought about was that there really is only one true story, with a bunch of warning labels tacked onto it. In other words, I think Campbell had it mostly right in that the one true story always begins with a call to adventure, and then it ends in one of two ways. Sometimes the artist's warnings labels, they overwhelm the story, in which case we get a tragedy, kind of one big fat warning label at the end, you could say. And in other cases, The other cases we get a master of two worlds, meaning the material and the spiritual. Everything else is just a bunch of time wasting crap like soap operas and, propaganda and whatnot. Stuff that's shaped like a story, but really isn't when you peel back the curtain a little bit. And so with that in mind, I think the artist's job is primarily to tell the one true story in his own unique voice and style. And particularly, in the design and construction of all those warning labels. These would be, the monsters and the traps and all of the other challenges that get in the way of the story's natural conclusion, which again is either tragedy or master of two worlds. And by reading those stories, and even in writing them, I think it makes us think about, well, how would we overcome similar challenges in the stories of our own lives? And in the case of tragedy, I think the focus is more on, well, how might we fail? And what's the cost of those failures? And so, but what I'm wondering lately, if tragedy, meaning that ultimate label of total ruin, isn't by nature inferior to the master of two worlds endings, just naturally inferior. Like I've always thought of Moby Dick as one of the greatest novels I've ever read. And you could argue that it more or less follows the hero's journey template and even has elements of the classic hero in Queequeg, for example. But ultimately, at the end of that novel, Ishmael's rescue from the sea just leaves him a survivor of ruin, of tragedy, not a master of worlds. In the end, he's rescued, if you think about it, he's rescued by what? By a combination of an accident, the monster toppling him off the ship, a dead man, Queequeg's coffin, and a princess comes and rescues him. Ultimately, he's no hero at all. He's basically a spectator in his own life story. It's the pessimism of a heroic and adventurous world that's been lost to what Melville saw as the smallness of modernity in many ways. But the question is it still a great story? I think it is, but is it greater than the Odyssey? Is it greater than the labors of Hercules? Is it greater than Arthurian legend? I don't know if you guys read Duncan Rayburn's article recently. I think he showed us that it paled in comparison, even as something like The Tale of the White Stag. And so, with all of this in mind, again, one of the struggles I had was I came away not really knowing what Ren thought about all of this. Like, was any of that great art? Would he consider would he consider those great stories? And would he consider the template?
I think we can get some idea from the examples that he used. None of them were actually storytellers in the sense of mythologists.
Right.
They were all statesmen and historians.
Right, correct. And then he's mixing that with art. Like, I think, and art is like what is achieved, I think, by, again, not copying the style, but like following the structure. I think when I read it, like I said, okay, let me think of an example from history that Ren might agree was the proper way to go about it. You know what I came up with? Dracula. In other words, we could make inferior art, which I think Dracula is an inferior to Melville. Stoker is inferior, but we could make inferior art.
I couldn't finish Dracula. I tried reading it when I was a teenager and I got really bored.
Well, here's the thing, but Dracula has like some qualities of it that I think Ren was talking about, which is that like Stoker was trying to use the language of the times in order to create one giant warning label about, with a tacked on bit of like hope at the end that evil can be defeated. But he was using the lingua franca of the times. He was using like all of the symbols, all of the imagery, all of like the sort of the modern bits and pieces that like were stylized in the way that people actually spoke and acted, and the things that they did. It was a modern novel in its time. And so maybe he's saying that, like maybe he's saying the best we can do is like is make a Dracula, make a big warning label so that future generations will be able to go back and say, that's how they get it wrong. But like, I'm wondering if, and I agree we shouldn't be LARPing, we shouldn't, but but at the same time, I see value in something like a Renaissance fair. You know, maybe not a lot of value, but some. I mean, I think part of the reason that we should preserve certain old traditions is, you know, if we are indeed doomed for total collapse, we're going to have some folks who know how to do all this stuff most of us take for granted. You know, I was thinking about it, it's like guys like Hunter Duncan and Doc Hammer and Grant would be way more useful in some sort of Mad Max apocalypse type situation than me. At least in the material sense of surviving and rebuilding the world from scratch. You know, I guess at best I might be useful in, I don't know, helping to rig up a basic comms network. But how long would it be before we'd even get back to that stage? You know, we might be bow hunting and subsistence farming for decades before that happens. But I think also, just to loop in the story factor, I think part of that rebuilding effort will also include people who know how to tell the one true story and make great art from it. Like that's particularly the case when it comes to, let's say, something like repopulating the world. Because, you know, the death of romance and romantic art is the death of love, the death of sex, the death of families, the death of the world eventually. And so that storytelling capacity is very important. But what kind of stories will we tell? You know, it's sort of like, will we tell the story of tragedy? I think tragedy is more the type of story we tell when times are good, when nothing much is on the line, when times are stable. Would you use that language to describe our world? Maybe we should be telling heroic tales. You know, maybe we should be telling tales of heroes slaying dragons and rescuing princesses. Like,
well,
this
is why I mean, as a teenager, you know, almost throughout my life, I've never read Moby Dick, for instance. And part of that is, you know, every exposure that I've had to modernist literature, I just found it left a very bad taste in my mouth. I didn't find it particularly engaging. And I always gravitated much more towards genre fiction. You know, I would argue that the great literary epic of the 20th century is Lord of the Rings. I don't think that has been surpassed
100%.
Since it was written, and I can't think of anything written before the Lord of the Rings in the 20th century that was its equal. Now, it's genre, not just genre defining. It didn't just spawn the entire fantasy genre as it's currently understood. In many ways, it's era defining. Could something like that be written today? I'm not so sure it could be. I don't think, you know, think of the kind of man that Tolkien was. You know, steeped in these ancient traditions and myths, you know, an absolute master of, you know, all of folk tales and linguistics and philology, and, you know, with a deep and abiding Catholic faith. There are, I think, many who are inspired by his example who would love to try to live up to that, but I don't think there's anyone who does. And furthermore, you know, he had that protection, that stability of being a university professor at Oxford, I think, or Cambridge. I always get the two mixed up. Someone like that would not become a professor. You know, like he wouldn't have that that leisure that is necessary to just kind of potter around for his entire life, gradually putting together all of the material necessary in order to produce 4 books. I guess 5 if you count the Silmarillion, you know, like, but really just 4 actual novels, which is an incredibly, you know, in terms of like quantity and output, that's not prolific at all, right? But in terms of the quality, it's off the charts. But, you know, now, like, if you want to make your living as a man of letters, like, you got to hustle. You know, you're self-publishing on Amazon, you're trying to like pump out something like every 3 months. You don't have time to edit it properly, like, let alone like sit there and like really deeply, like, you know, ruminate over everything and like think through all the details and like really polish it and let it really flourish in your mind. Like, it's just not possible. The world's too busy now.
Possible is the other problem that I had with this article. This talk of what's possible and impossible bothers me a bit. We sling those words around so casually. And I'm like, the hubris of that, like, it's sort of like, what's possible? What's possible is I could hit the lotto tomorrow. well, I don't play lotto, but what's possible is that any one of us could strike it rich at some moment and have exactly that leisure. And that could happen anywhere in the world. The world's a very big place. So I think that's the core pessimism that I didn't like, this idea that it's impossible. And it's kind of like, we already have the template. As great as Tolkien was, he borrowed the template because the template is the one true story. He just had the greatness of style, the greatness of his artistic voice. And like you said, he also had that wealth of knowledge to draw upon. But to say
there's
that,
also, so like greatness, right? Like, this touches back to an earlier discussion we had about the concept of honor, which is partially connected to sort of recognition, being seen as being honorable, right? Getting credit for the things that you have done. Say Tolkien had written The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and it had never been noticed. He published it, no one bought it. It just kind of sank into obscurity without having made any mark on the culture. Exactly the same books, right? Now, would it still be great literature? I mean, like, objectively, it's the same literature, but it wouldn't have had any impact on culture. And so I don't think you couldn't hold it up as great literature. It's part of, great literature, part of great art. It's not just the quality of the art, it's also the fact that it is recognized as such. And one of the things that militates against great art being possible right now is also the fact that the wider culture itself is so debased. That, how much of an audience is there for that, really? You might have
the whole world.
You might have a few
the internet, John, the internet.
A few internet artists, yes. And like,
sure.
I mean, like, so like you take music as an example. I can find all sorts of amazing music that's come out in the last 20 years, stuff that really moves me, that I really can really get into. And it's sort of confined to, it's all confined to these like little subcultural niches. It has no impact on the wider culture at all, right? And in a sense, that's fine. Like, if you want it, it's there. You can access it, you can participate in that, and you can enjoy it. You can fill your life with that, and that is, in a sense, enough. And certainly from the point of view of the artist, in terms of making a living, like, that can easily be enough, right? Like, you have the whole internet, to sell your stuff to people. But is it going to change the direction of the culture in any measurable way? And the answer is almost certainly it will not.
And will it
be remembered in 50 or 100 years as great art? Like, again, probably not, because it didn't get that wide adoption and recognition. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay, so all right, so here's a bestseller for you. It's called The Gospels, right? And this happened before the printing press. This happened before the internet, for TikTok, for any of these democratized or pseudo-democratized global platforms happen. And the story that they tell is the one true story, right? The story that they tell is the story of the hero's journey. So, and this is where Tolkien comes in his success, because I do believe his success, yes, part of it was his leisure, part of it was that he had people around him, editors, publishers, people that believed in it. And I think all of that machinery is important, but I also think that the best stories find a way to tell themselves. So, like, if I tried to summarize my belief in Christianity, it would be that I believe Jesus Christ was the manifestation of the one true story in the flesh. In other words, he was simultaneously all hero, all story, all storyteller, and all artist, with basically no warning labels attached to that story. For instance, we don't really get to see what happens during the span of life before he was when he was refusing the call to adventure. Everything that happened up until his baptism in the woods, essentially, it's all blanked out. We have no idea. And during it, he was this artist.
Just
like,
just
when
to
the story
interject
was
them,
unfolding.
just to interject, I'm pretty sure some of the
Yeah.
Gnostic Gospels actually do, and like the Apocrypha actually do discuss like the events of
They
his,
do.
The prequels.
They
Yeah.
do. They do. They're contentious, but I'm saying that even stripped of that, that's true. And like also discussing, for instance, like, well, the devil tempted him in the woods for 40 days. Like what were those temptations? We're not told, and you're right. There are some sources that tell them. But like, I guess my point is that the entire story, even if we do accept that, it is a complete story, complete with warning labels and all. But during the adventurous part of it, let's say, Jesus was an artist who was, he was mostly just dishing out the warning labels himself directly through his own stories, instead of constantly illustrating them through a bunch of action movie bullshit. Like, in any case, I think he was trying to show us that God himself was a storyteller and an artist, and at the same time, art. So when Jesus is casting out demons and healing lepers and whatnot, that wasn't what the story was about, because Jesus never had any problem with doing that. It wasn't a challenge for him. He was able to do those things with his voice and authority alone. In other words, he could speak the story directly into existence, just like an author can do on the page. And so, like, in other words, so that story, which is the fundamental structure, I think, revealed in its most absolute manifestation of form, that story has continued on and again, like, was able to spread around itself without any of the university systems or the publishing industry, or, yes, it needed champions. All stories need champions. But I'm saying that, like, to say it's impossible for the greatness of that fundamental story to just kind of rear its head all of a sudden out of nowhere and spawn itself around the internet, I think it's a little too pessimistic, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, it came across as too pessimistic to me. Then again, I have my own conception of what's going on. I don't think that, John talked a little bit about how there's no monoculture anymore, but that's not a consequence of things sucking as much as it is just evolution of information technology. So what I think I think the reason that things seem like they suck so bad is because a lot of the stuff that's force fed us in the artificial monoculture is propaganda. And I think a lot of the stuff that people are making independently of that are outside of that vast censorship, state funded and influenced media apparatus is really good. It's just not as easy to find. And then you don't get that same monoculture effect where everybody's talking about and it's having an influence on a monoculture. But if you just look at it in terms of sheer numbers, comparing now versus, 10,000 years ago or even 2,000 years ago, I mean, we have subcultures that share a lot of priors, that consume similar content, that have larger numbers than the entire world did at points in our history. So I'm with Mark. I think that really excellent art could turn up at any time, anywhere. And I'm really inclined to believe that, because I don't know, maybe I'm less, like, I get this feeling from folks that are really, I don't know, I get the sense that they fetishize the classics a little bit. And maybe that's just me being uncultured, feeling that way. But I feel like it's pretentious bullshit. I look at art, and if I like it and it's like sick, I just love it. I don't care. I don't overanalyze it. And to me, it's like you mentioned Lord of the Rings. It's just sick. It's a awesome story. It's so deep on every level. It's satisfying and inspirational and all these things. And I think another piece of it is art's a two-way street. It's the observer, it's who's consuming it and being exposed to it, in addition to the artist. And we have an ability to manage our expectations accordingly. Like it's a two-way street for responsibility. So, it's like, I think John mentioned they would throw in obscure references in the past and expect the reader to know it. Less of that's going to happen now, and that detracts from the depth of stories that can be told, because you can't just reference something and expect that somebody's going to know all the background. But at the same time, as an observer, you can acknowledge that and enjoy what's available for what it is, instead of expecting or wanting or fetishizing greatness. I don't know. I think art's subjective. Like your enjoyment of it is highly subjective, and there are commonalities between us because of nature, and we're all human beings, and there's a lot of commonalities, and I believe in archetypes and all that. But at the end of the day, if you think something's great and it inspires you, then I don't give a shit what somebody else says about it. And I think the reason things seem so bleak is because of propaganda. And I think I feel like modern art is propaganda. I think it's related to what we talked about last time in the confidence crisis. I think it's all related. I think we're having something systematically put in front of us that just sucks really bad, and it's anchoring our expectations. But I like, especially for writing a book, everybody has access to all of the literature. Everybody has access, and nobody can censor what somebody writes in a book, right? For like large scale media that has a lot of monetary inputs, that's harder to get a project like that off the ground. And there's economic reasons that all that stuff's very derivative. But in terms of just creating your own story, I think there's tremendous potential that we're going to see awesome stories.
So I think something I was just thinking as you were saying this of Johann Kurtz's piece this week about liturgy, and as like the work of the people, something that kind of binds you to your culture in sort of time and space. I think when you're partaking of the classics, of great art, in the sense of art that has been recognized through time as great, it's not just that you have that subjective appreciation of it, although that's certainly an element. There's also this sense that you are partaking in something that many others have also partaken in. It's a kind of communion. And as you were saying, the propaganda aspect, like what's being put in front of us from the kind of organs of official culture, is reliably shit. And I think that is actually the core of the problem more than anything. If I go into a bookstore, I used to, just 20 years ago, I could go into a bookstore and I would spend an hour looking in the shelves and, be unable to decide between 50 different books that I wanted to buy, because I only had money for one. Now I go in there, I spend an hour, and I can't find one that I actually want to read. Because they're just all shit. It's all propaganda. It's all just empty and hollow. And the same with the movies and the theater, right? When we were kids, be like, oh, I want to see this, and I want to see that, and I want to see this. Now it's like, is there anything worth watching? And it's just so that gives the impression that there's no good art. But I think
it's an illusion, because there's a blizzard of bad.
There's
just so much more media to dig through for our gems,
right. There's a huge amount, right? And there's also a huge amount of really good stuff. The problem has always been that there's more shit than there is good stuff, right? Like that's never not been the case. But that's why we developed gatekeeping mechanisms, tastemakers and editors and publishers and such, who their job was to kind of comb through all the crap and like find the few gems and sort of like hold them up to everyone and be like, here, this is really good. And like, because people like, they had a good reputation, people trusted, their taste. They had certain ability as kingmakers in that regard. And
is curator, you're talking about curators and patrons, which
kind of thing,
historically,
right? Exactly,
yeah,
right.
That
And like
system,
if you look at like movies, right? Movies are part of anime. Anime is a great example of this. So I said almost every anime that gets made starts out as a manga, right? And there's way more manga than there is anime. And if something really takes off as a manga, then one of the studios picks it up and like turns it into a movie, right? And like, sort of similarly with a lot of movies, it's like, you have a huge number of writers out there and they're churning out all this stuff, and then some small number of them get picked up by a major publishing house, and of those, some of them will have like a bestseller, people really like it, we do really well, and then of those, some of them will get picked up by a major movie studio, and they make a blockbuster movie, and millions and millions of people watch the movie, and like way more people see the movie than read the book. Maybe some people read the book because they watched the movie, right? That's how it's kind of supposed to work, that you have this kind of funneling effect where you sort of like you're generating all of this raw culture, and then kind of like you sort of pick up the good stuff and you sort of funnel it together and you hold that in front of as many eyeballs as possible, and this kind of creates this shared sense of what's good. And the problem we have now, what I'm getting at, the problem we have now is that this has been corrupted. That the people who have been running these, movie studios and publishing houses and so on, like they're all political. They all like, right? And like
it's been more than corrupted. It's been weaponized. So
yeah, exactly.
But all these things that you mentioned, they grew organically. And they had power to do something because they were serving a legitimate purpose, and that purpose, there's market demand for that function. And so the fact that it's been weaponized, it's totally lost its market function, its whole purpose, its whole telos in the first
Wait a minute. Can I push back against some of this with a story? Okay, because like I agree though. I'm sorry, but I agree with what you guys are saying to a point. But I think we're missing mechanisms that are developing. In other words, I think that old model is dying. The old model of curation and the grand patron, we're all seeing that it's dying, right? Even the publishing industry is dying. Everything is dying. You know what's not dying? Crowdsourcing. So there's a guy. Have you guys ever heard of a guy named Young Ripa?
Yeah,
it's Eric July. Eric July. Okay, so Eric July. Here's the story of Eric July. Eric July is a Black American comic book nerd. Eric July is anti-woke. Eric July started a YouTube channel that now has over 500,000 subscribers to it.
Ascendant or something like that. This is
it's ISOM. No, is the name of his brand.
No, but he not his YouTube channel, but he came up with like a superhero universe or something and got like a huge amount of Patreon support for it.
It's called the Rippaverse. And like he's only done what he's working on his second earliest. Right. And so here's what happened with Eric July. Eric July was, bitching and moaning about the destruction, just like we all are, of art into its deracination into propaganda, the fact that it had been weaponized, the fact that all of the routes, the traditional routes to publishing had been cut off. So you know what he did? He said, fuck it, I'm going to publish my own thing. And you're going to fund it. He asked the audience that he built up, spent years building up, who trusted him because they knew that he was against all of these things. And you know what he got? He got like $3 million out of it, out of one crowdsourced campaign. Okay, that's the power that's at everybody's fingertips. And I think when we dwell on like everything that's being lost, and this links back into the article, because he's right, some things are lost, but other things can be gained if we have the senses to kind of look at the world as it is. Again, not as it was and not as we wish it was, but if we look at the instruments that are available to us, I think that actually we are in a great position to be able to tell great stories, to be able to make great art, because we can get audiences. We could go direct in ways that we never could. A lot of those gatekeepers, guess what? Like, John, when you were saying that, like, how much was left on the cutting room floor? What if Lord of the Rings had never attracted any eyeballs because some gatekeepers kept them out? Well, we don't
Oh,
have that problem
oh,
anymore.
believe me, I know, and I'd be the first to, sort of bemoan the tendency, for instance, the big studios to make some incredibly boneheaded decisions in terms of like what to make, what not to make, and what changes to introduce. A lot of scripts have been ruined by the producer, sticking his fingers in, for instance. So I mean, like that system never worked perfectly. It did
Now we
serve
can sidestep it.
and the same thing was certainly true of publishing houses. Like that never worked perfectly, right? Like there'd always be like some writers who were actually really good who would keep getting rejected by publishers. And you're right, we can sidestep it entirely. It creates a different problem from the point of view of the reader, though. So rather than having to choose between a relatively small amount of curated content, which is of fairly decent quality overall because of that curation, you now have this absolute flood of stuff, some of which is really good, a lot of which is garbage. And then of course there's the AI question, like what's that going to do, right? Because you know that there are already books on Amazon written entirely by AI.
Mark,
And they're all boring, I'm sure.
I'm sure
Mark,
there's shit, right? I'm sure there's
that-
shit, but from the point of view of the reader, right? Or the consumer of art, like you're put in this position of how do you choose what to put your time into reading or consuming, right? Like not even forget about money. That's actually not even really the issue for most people. The really limited quality, really limited thing is time.
yeah,
And
for now.
well,
But so Mark, like that's not pushback, Mark. That's what we're both getting at. I mean, John has a weekly list of articles that he curates, for God's sakes. Like he's doing it already. And so do you with trying to consolidate information that's on the Demo Station Slack. My point is that the market demand for this service is not being met. And so
that's what I was getting at. That's
routed
exactly what I was getting at. Thank you.
it's going to get routed around. It's already getting routed around. The decrepit system that's been weaponized is not serving the function that people have a deep intrinsic desire for it to serve, and so it's going to get routed around. It's going to fail. It's in the process of failing. That's what's in the process of failing. Society's not necessarily going to collapse. That might be why it seems like it is. And as soon as it gets routed around, then I think we're going to be in a much better space. I don't think that it's nearly as dire as Ren suggests.
Well,
no, it's like we hold all the cards and we don't know it. Go ahead, Harris.
So a couple things. One, I'll just throw this out there as a possibility, because when I was reading Ren's article, it didn't seem as pessimistic to me. I saw it more as a work of rhetoric with the purpose of inspiring like dissident artists to try new things. I saw it as basically saying, don't just try to repeat the style of the past. Don't just like reject the modern like vernacular simply because it's modern, and don't just try to write a new Greek myth in the style of the Greeks, or don't try to write a Tolkien in the style of Tolkien, but you have to adopt the environment that you're in and create something within it. And by saying, so it's the article saying fail better. So you're probably not going to create a masterpiece, but you should be trying. And I think I almost saw the pessimism as a spur to new creations that will be interesting and not just rehashes of, you know, Robert Howard or something like that. Like, don't just try to create something that's already been done. Actually, so this is, I saw it more as a call to the actual creators out there who are making things to, okay, try doing your own thing. And it might you know, it might be 100 years before anything great is created, but try anyways. It's like, well, that doesn't necessarily have to be true, but for someone to think that, okay, well, maybe it kind of takes the pressure off. Well, I don't have to create something, you know, maybe my grandkids will, but it doesn't mean it's not going to be created. It doesn't mean it's impossible. Like, I just searched the article, and the only time he says impossible is in a different context entirely. Like, I well, I don't know. I don't know the guy. I don't you know, maybe if we talked to him or interviewed him sometime, he would be a total pessimist. But I have the feeling that he'd probably agree with a lot of the things that you guys were saying, in that it's not impossible in principle. It's just, here are all the difficulties surrounding it. But I think one of the things that's also come up in the discussion is the importance of the audience as the new curator. This kind of crowdsourcing the curation, is that it's our, or it's the audience like us, or it's just the audience in general. It's their role to say, no, all of this stuff is shit, and we're just going to ignore it, and we're going to forget about it. And in 20 years, no one is going to remember the, you know, 95% of the, you know, the crap that's put out by major studios, because they're only going to remember the stuff they like. So, and again, like you guys have mentioned, every year, even though most stuff is crap, every year there's at least a few good movies that come out that will probably be remembered for, you know, for decades, generations probably, that those will just be the only ones that are remembered, because all the other stuff was such crap. So I think that it's kind of our role, if we're not those people actually creating this type of art, to support the stuff that we find and be like, okay, well, this is the new canon. You know, this is the stuff that people have to pay attention to, and to kind of keep it alive. Because, John, like you said, like, studios have interfered and ruined a lot of good things. And ironically, a lot of those things that they ruined or that weren't popular at the time, are the things that are now popular, and the things that are now remembered, and now remembered as classics, the kind of underground classics that were never popular at the time, but now they're the things that everyone remembers. So I think that's kind of the audience's role in all of this, is to act as that curator now, to be like, no. And you see this on YouTube, for instance, with guys like Critical Drinker, who are like, okay, no, all this stuff sucks. Oh, but here are the 3 movies that came out this year that are actually really decent and that you'll probably enjoy. And then you look on Rotten Tomatoes, those are the ones with like 95, 99% audience scores. And those are the ones that I think people are actually watching and enjoying. And, you know, those are the ones that will then create the, like, those are the things that people are watching and reading today, that will influence the new things that might be underground, because it is hard to get, like, there's only so much good, like, let's say TV or movie, you know, film material that can be made because of the studios. There's certain things you can't say, certain things you have to do, but every once in a while there's something that kind of breaks through. It's like, I mean, look at the Northman. Like, Robert Eggers, the filmmaker, the guy that made it. I mean, he's pretty, like, a typical kind of left coast, I'd say. Well, he's not from the left coast, like the West Coast, but he's the typical artist mentality. But because he's a stickler for historical accuracy, you don't have any race swapping in there. You don't, like, he's like, I just want to make an accurate Viking movie.
It's shocking that movie was made in the current year. Great
right,
film.
but it got made, right?
Yeah,
That's a really good
it got
point,
made
man.
because he had so much success. All right.
I'm glad that you try to, like, you know, swing the conversation, like, back around to the stylistic issue, because I do think that was sort of the core point that Ren was trying to drive home for the audience. There was that we kind of need a new style. We need something that matches the time in which we live, right? And he wasn't trying to define what that style is. That there would be a huge amount of hubris involved in doing that. As I'm sure he would be the first to agree, but more to kind of like, put that out there for people to kind of consider, and then, see what bubbles up from the culture as a result of that. Because this does kind of have to happen organically.
Yeah, if
Well,
you
to
look at
Brent's
it,
point too, I
think,
mean, like,
and I think there's a pretty good chance. I don't know. I mean, when I was reading it, what I started thinking about, first thing I thought about was kind of like, what's happening in the kind of weird corners in Substack, where people are starting to be a little bit more experimental in how they compose things, right? Like, they're not just doing like listicles or academic writing, or trying to be all like pompous and serious and such. And some people are doing that. It's fine. And then others are really having fun with it. You look at someone like Elgato Malo, for instance, and he's absurd but also really on point. Or Eugippius, who is just like a really impressive prose stylist who is able to make like very cogent points, but phrased in this fashion that kind of like veers between sort of like internet speak and like really high level intellectualization. And I think these people,
or Mark Brazone,
or Mark Brazone, who
proved that ChatGPT can't tell a fucking story about a banjo, man.
Well, actually, I mean, Mark, like your style, I find very interesting.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
You know that but you kind of like, you'll sort of like weave together like like fiction and like philosophy in this kind of like way that I very rarely find, and it's very fresh and engaging.
Well, thank you.
Is that what the new style is going to be like? I don't know, right? Like, because it is this kind of experimental thing, and you have like all of these writers kind of like just kind of like doing their own thing and sort of riffing off each other.
Zero HP Lovecraft.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. No.
Who's reaching back into the past and at the same time like doing something new.
In the group chat, you were like, oh God, is it just gonna be people like talking in emojis? Like, I don't know if you read his did you read a story? Don't tell me what to think.
Oh yes. Yes.
God damn.
I was assaulted by it. Let's put it that way.
Oh man. Oh, so it was like wading through Tumblr, man. It was so bad. It was really good, but like, ow.
It was also a retelling of the story.
Harrison's point that if you look at it from the perspective that it was rhetoric trying to inspire a new wave of artists, like it's pretty brilliant. I didn't look at it like that, but in retrospect, the encouragement to try new things, but then also to manage expectations at the same time and take the pressure off. I think that's the magical combination that's needed. So, perhaps that's exactly where he was coming from. And in that case, it's, it's just a really good point, Harrison.
Well, just one more thing on that. Just one more thing really quick. I kind of saw it as when you have a movement, and like Ren is kind of like a big figure in a movement or in a certain sphere, right? And when someone like that sees something that they don't like, I mean, I saw this as a kind of like gentle correction, like, hey, I like all you guys, but you got to stop just LARPing, essentially, just kind of like trying to recreate stuff that's already been done. Kind of like I found it as I kind of found it like to be a tactful way of saying, stop doing this, you guys, essentially. But go on, Mark.
No, I was going to say, Harrison, the other thing that you came up with, which I think was missing from the paradigm of sort of curator and patron, right? But there's another character that's missing, and you clearly defined it as the critic, which is neither nor, but something that like people grasp onto. They say, if I trust a critic, like there's the great ending of, sorry to spoil a 30-year-old movie, but or however long it is, the end of Ratatouille, where Anton Ego kind of describes the critic's role as being a defender of the new. And I think that that's something like that. Like, and it's also, you know, if we talk about Critical Drinker or the whole YouTuber, there's a whole ecosystem there of like people that are aggressive critics that dig through all of this trash to try to find gems. But along the way, they're important in that they're calling out what is trash and why it's trash. And that's also an important function. They're kind of like an anti-patron in that way. And I think that in a time, in a media situation in which we live in, which is a blizzard of endless content coming from every possible source, what they're doing, I think, is refining a taste and a palate. And I think the taste and palate is important. And to what Grant was saying, it's important because it's sort of like, yeah, I agree with Grant to some degree. It's just sort of like, yeah, I don't know art, but I know what I like. Like I'm also simple in that way. I'm not addicted to the past or anything. I didn't have a classical education. I had an imperial one, which meant I was essentially trained in prison habits, right? I did not attend Oxford. I didn't have any of, what I know, I kind of taught myself. And so I'm in the same boat where I'm just sort of like, I don't give a fuck like where this came from. I don't care, oh, do you not recognize the architecture of this ancient myth within this story? It's sort of like, no, I recognize the warning labels because of my experience of reality, and also somewhat because of what I read, but more so, like if we're going to create this great art of the future, and I think that we have to, and I think it's going to have to be heroic. And I think that at the end of it, it doesn't need to be, it can't be tragedy, but must end in that hero of two worlds. In the, like even the story of Jesus Christ, like ends in the correct way, which says that I can stand in heaven and on earth, and I can walk in both worlds. Like, as long as that's the template, we could have a million Lord of the Rings that spring out of that, for all we know. Probably not because of Pareto curves, and that excellence does not present itself at a wide level. We all know that. Otherwise it wouldn't be excellence, and we'd all be Marxist and retarded. But the fact of the matter is that it can spring from somewhere. And I think that to some degree, and this is just me and my business, but I actually think that to a degree, certain patterns, including patterns of stories, find a way to emerge through some mechanism that I can't understand, and that a lot of people pretend with a lot of jargon they can understand, but which we might as well call fate or destiny or something like that. And all of these great works that I think that Ren is pointing back to, I think they contain an element of those things. Like, part of what's been lost is the spiritual. I think even atheists in our circles would agree that there's something that's been lost that is ineffable, at the very least, like something that we can't touch and totally explain, but which nevertheless exists and ought to be honored, even in our inability to describe it. Does that make any sense, Grant? I don't know.
Yeah, it does. And I think that that's what people are going to go looking for. I think because there's demand for it. People want to see that. I'm pretty optimistic that there's going to be a way through. I think that if people focus on doing new stuff that's dope, I think we're going to be in a good position. If Harrison's right that this was Ren's way of kind of chastising some of the people that constantly, are fixated upon, return with the V instead of the U. That shit pisses me off, man. I'm gonna be honest with you. Like, there's no going back. That's dumb. Let's focus on finding a way ahead. By all means, learn lessons from great stuff in the past, and try and apply what you can. But yeah, Harrison.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that brings me back to what I said at the beginning of our discussion here, reading Turchin's book. it's one of the points, because this applies also in the political realm and to the political theorists that are around, proposing all kinds of ways to go forward, like the new system. Well, we should, like the kind of like the neo-reactionaries who want like a literal return to, or some of them at least, a literal return to kind of like absolute autocracy. And like some things just won't be possible. And this is a point that I think that Ren gets to just in those first couple paragraphs, and maybe a bit further in the article, is that that's not the way the world works. So this is something that's not the way societies or humans work. You can go back and you can find principles and maybe find ways to apply them in the future, but it's not going to work out the way that you think it will, probably. And the examples that Turchin gives is that in the context of large scale societies, that there is a very strong like law of continuity, that the overall shape of the system is going to persist unless the society totally like gets disintegrated and like just totally falls apart and is exterminated, or gets incorporated and like defeated and incorporated by some other state and just kind of like loses itself completely. If that doesn't happen, the form will continue on. And he gives the examples of Egypt, which has been a militocracy for 800 years, and no matter what happens, it just keeps going to militocracy because that's the established form. It would be very, very difficult to implement any other type of system in Egypt. In China, it's been a bureaucracy, like a literal like political bureaucracy for 2,000 years or more. And what were some of the other examples? He gives a few other examples, but
Western countries have been sort of like military republics, or monarchies, but with strongly Republican attributes. Right. Again, for pretty much like the entire like breadth of Indo-European history, which is
so if you think you're going to replace that,
why the current plutocracy in the U.S. feels so awkward for everyone. It's just like everyone kind of has this. It's like, oh, it just doesn't feel natural, and it can't. So they can try to impose something different. But yeah, I think what you're kind of getting at there is it's probably not going to last very long.
Expand on that. What's not going to last long?
Like this, the kind of cultural revolution that they are trying to impose. Yeah. This sort of like Plato's Republic, this ant-like communism that they're trying to turn everything into. It's like it doesn't match the temperament of the people, going back a very long time here or in most other countries for that matter.
And it also doesn't match the one true story. Nobody ends up as the master of both worlds. So they end up as the slave of both.
Yeah.
You know, it is the anti-story.
Yeah, another essay from last week, I think, which is worth mentioning as relevant here, is Jeff Russell's discussion of authenticity versus validity, because that kind of touches directly on this question of, return to be, right? This tendency to think that, if we just blindly follow the rituals of the past without really understanding them, but we just follow the forms, then that will bring the past back. And the point he made there, that he tried doing that in his own magical practice and it did not work. He had to instead really believe and then start experimenting with something that was not authentic in any historical sense, but that actually ended up, in his opinion, being far more valid. By sort of like
because it was a cargo cult before. Yeah, sorry.
Exactly, and instead, like he found that it was more effective to sort of like take those elements that worked from tradition and then incorporate them in something that matched his actual conditions and experiences. And I think that's kind of what Ren was kind of getting at, like not don't try to ape the past. Like certainly look to it for inspiration, take everything you can from it, but don't be trapped by it. Don't just kind of like robotically follow the forms, you know, don't robotically reject everything modern.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Absolutely.
modern
He's
stuff that's
right
cool.
about that. Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna write a story about the Tonic 7. We're gonna take down Skynet, blah, blah, blah. You know, I'll be the guy in what's the name of that movie with Schwarzenegger? Running Man. I'll be the nerd that gets taken down by the lightning man in the tunnel as I'm given the code to these stories write themselves. Like, in other words, all I'm saying is that if we're going to write, like, I don't know if Tacitus is the right example. Like, I understand what and I don't know that I haven't read that much, and I'm one of those guys. I can't read natural Greek. Can't do it. Or Latin.
I don't get the sense that Ren has a deeply literary background. I think from reading his stuff before, I think he has a pretty strong background in classics on the one hand, and sort of health and fitness on the other. Those are the two kind of subjects that he kind of goes between. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you say it's great. I don't even disagree with him. My only problem with it is I wasn't really sure, and you guys have actually helped quite a bit to clarify for me what he was getting at. And I think I agree with some amalgam of what you're all saying, and I agree with him. Therefore, it's just sort of like, well, no, don't go back and LARP. Don't be ChatGPT of like 3rd century AD or something like that. Like, don't be the generative, bullshitters that are like reaching back into the past and altering something slightly and saying, hey, it's original, and also we've revived the past. No, I agree with that. That's not going to fucking happen. But at the same time, I don't want to abandon everything. The Greek monsters mean something to me, and even though I will stylize them differently, I know that the spirit of those creatures is the same. The spirit of those dangers is similar. It's just that, I need to find my own voice. And like H.P. Lovecraft, or I should say, I'm sorry, Zero H.P. Lovecraft would be an example of, and I didn't mention him or her or whatever it is. I didn't mention by name in my Black Speech of Mortar, but I think that work was on my mind a bit, if that makes any sense. And it's not a criticism. I'm not trying to dunk on him.
Which work? By Zero H.P. Lovecraft?
Zero H.P. Lovecraft. Yeah, I think
that's
wields
definitely a him.
Well, he wields the Black Speech, and he wields it well. And I just think that each one of us as an author is going to try to find our own way. And I'm not disparaging him for finding his way in that, if that makes any sense. What I'm saying is, I'm just sort of like, each one of us is going to have to find our way to tell the kind of stories that will, if not great, good. And like, maybe that's what he's saying too. It's like good enough for the time. But like, and I would not call Zero H.P. Lovecraft's work great. I don't think anybody would. It's good. And it's also dangerous in my opinion, but that's for him to work out and for me to work out. You know what I mean?
Well, he describes himself as a horrorist, of course, right? Just like H.P. Lovecraft was. And, the thing with H.P. Lovecraft, as a stylist, the man is amazing. His imagination was incredibly rich. You can get a huge amount of insight into Western culture by reading H.P. Lovecraft, because he's sort of delving into the deep subconscious fears that were unlocked by the Age of Reason. One should probably not look to him for spiritual advice, however. The cosmos that he is illustrating is sort of the spiritualized version of Bertrand Russell's worldview built on a foundation of unyielding despair, which I think is not actually accurate in the highest possible analysis. I don't think the world really is that way, right? I think Tolkien's worldview or C.S. Lewis's worldview is ultimately far more, far closer to reality, if not that, at least psychologically.
Well, Lovecraft was like, I would say, if somebody said, who's the purest horror writer, it would be Lovecraft, or possibly Cormac McCarthy, because I think I've worked. If I think about Blood Meridian, I think about that as a work of essentially pure horror. Even though it's of the somewhat mundane kind, and I only will give the qualifier somewhat. But H.P. Lovecraft absolutely was on that line. He was there at the veil. He was staring deep into the face of the enemy, and he was recording it. And he found no comedy behind it, which I think was kind of a problem.
It's very similar to Nietzsche in a sense, right? He
correct.
confronted the darkness that lurks at the heart of the modern Western mind, and he looked at it without any filter, and in Nietzsche's case, that drove him mad ultimately. He stared too long into the abyss, and the abyss stared back. As
both men, I think that's true. And it's sort of like, that's what happens when you're
Lovecraft died young, did he not? Quite young. I mean, a lot of those pulp writers did, but
that's the danger of being a reporter in hell.
Yes.
And same thing with Jack Parsons, by the way, I might add.
Yes.
If you were a correspondent in hell, you're going to have a very short life and a very interesting death.
I would say Jack Parsons, say what you will, he had a very interesting life. Short, but very eventful.
Oh yeah. Well, he declared himself the Antichrist. That's one hell of an interesting life.
All right, guys. Do we want anything to wrap up on Ren, or any final thoughts on this discussion?
My only final thought is that to any writers out there who are listening to this, you should certainly read that article if you haven't, and let that and this discussion inspire you to experiment with your style and your subject matter. And play around. Let's try to do something new.
And then if you're on Substack, then just drop a link in John's comments, and maybe he'll put you in the next roundup, right?
We never know.
All right. So we'll see you next week, everyone. This has been another Tonic discussion, and we'll be back for another interesting conversation on an as yet unknown topic. So tune in. Bye-bye.